Mark Johnson had been driving Route 47 for years, and most nights felt the same. However, this one began with a strange heaviness in the air, a cold that crept under the skin, and a silence that felt too sharp to ignore. He sensed something waiting. The sky hung low with bruised clouds, and the last hints of daylight faded behind the trees. Only a few passengers rode with him. An elderly couple sat quietly, a young man scrolled through his phone, and a tired factory worker leaned against the window half asleep. Mark focused on the road ahead, trying to shake an uneasy feeling he could not explain. He had been through enough strange moments in his life to recognize when something was off, and tonight felt undeniably wrong. He gripped the wheel tighter. As the bus approached the old picnic area stop, the darkness thickened. The moment the doors opened, a small blur of motion shot inside. A puppy, drenched, shivering, and terrified, crashed into Mark's boots with a desperate cry that made everyone on board freeze. The little creature trembled violently. Its fur was matted with mud, and its paws scraped helplessly against the floor. It looked up at Mark with wide, pleading eyes, letting out a soft cry that carried more fear than any sound he had heard recently. Passengers gasped in shock, unsure of what to make of the sudden intruder. However, Mark immediately sensed that this was not an accident. The puppy was not simply frightened. It was begging for him to follow, urging him towards something urgent and unseen. The puppy tugged weakly at his pant leg, then ran toward the open door. It paused, looked back at him, and cried again. Every instinct in Mark's body told him that something terrible waited beyond the trees. He stepped off the bus without hesitation. The puppy led him quickly into the woods. Branches cracked under Mark's boots, and the cold air burned in his lungs as he tried to keep up. Each time he slowed, the puppy whimpered louder, desperate for him to follow faster. Mark's pulse hammered. A faint sound drifted through the trees. It was thin, muffled, almost swallowed by the wind, but it was unmistakably human. Mark's heart raced. The puppy bolted ahead and stopped near a collapsed wooden structure, barking frantically as if pointing him toward the source. Mark rushed forward and dropped to his knees. Beneath a heavy metal sheet, two teenagers lay trapped. Their faces were pale, their breaths shallow, and their clothes soaked from hours spent in the freezing woods. One lifted a weak hand toward him. "Please help us," the boy whispered, his voice barely more than a tremor. Mark swallowed hard and inspected the situation quickly. The metal slab pinning them looked heavy, dangerously unstable, and slick with rain. He knew he would have only one chance to lift it. Mark planted his feet, gripped the jagged edge, and pulled with everything he had. His muscles screamed, his arms shook violently, but inch by inch, the metal shifted. The teenagers cried out as the weight lifted enough for Mark to drag them free. He wrapped his jacket around the younger boy and lifted him into his arms. The older one leaned against him, barely able to stand. They moved toward the bus slowly, the puppy staying close, whining softly as it checked on them with every step. When they reached the warm interior of the bus, the passengers worked together without hesitation. Blankets were wrapped, heaters turned toward the boys, and comforting hands steadied trembling shoulders. The puppy climbed onto the seat between them and refused to move. Mark watched the scene with a tightness in his chest. The fear, the relief, the gratitude in the boy's eyes struck him deeply. He looked at the small puppy beside them, a creature with no collar, no owner, and no hesitation to save lives. Mark felt a surge of emotion that he could not suppress. The puppy pressed its tiny nose against one boy's hand, offering comfort with a gentleness that seemed far beyond its size. Its trembling slowly eased as it realized the boys were safe at last. The bus interior had transformed into a shelter of warmth and urgency. The elderly woman whispered calming words, the young man fetched water from his bag, and the factory worker guided the boys to breathe slowly. Mark stood still for a moment, absorbing the fragile scene before him. He stepped outside to radio for emergency assistance, his hands shaking slightly as he relayed the situation. The dispatcher promised help would arrive shortly. Mark's breath fogged in the cold night as he looked back toward the woods where the puppy had appeared. He could not stop thinking about the terrifying possibility that no one would have found the boys in time. The cold, the isolation, the falling debris, everything had created a deadly trap. That small puppy had been their only link to survival, and it had chosen him. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics hurried onto the bus, assessed the boys, and praised the quick actions that saved their lives. They thanked Mark personally, but he shook his head and pointed toward the puppy sitting proudly on the seat. The paramedics smiled at the sight of the tiny rescuer. They carefully lifted the boys onto stretchers, and each one reached out to pat the puppy before being taken outside. The puppy's ears lowered as they left, as if it understood exactly what was happening. The boy's mother arrived moments later, rushing into the scene with tears streaming down her face. She embraced her sons tightly before turning to Mark with trembling gratitude. Her voice broke as she thanked him for responding to a cry no one else would have noticed. Mark looked down at the puppy again. It sat quietly now, its tail thumping softly against the seat. He gently reached down and lifted it into his arms. The puppy nestled into his chest with complete trust, as though it had known him forever. Over the following days, the story spread quickly through Redwood Springs. Neighbors, passengers, and even local news outlets spoke about the brave little puppy that had stopped a bus and led a driver into the woods to save 2 lives. People began calling it a hero. Mark visited the hospital to check on the boys, who were recovering well. When asked about the puppy, they smiled and said it had stayed with them until it knew they were safe. They believed it had been watching over them long before the accident. The puppy had no collar and no sign of an owner. It had simply appeared when the boys most needed help. Mark knew the answer before anyone asked the question. He decided to bring the puppy home and give it the family it deserved. From that night on, the puppy rode with him on Route 47. Passengers greeted it with smiles, and many still whispered the story of how courage sometimes comes in the smallest forms. Mark often glanced at it beside him, grateful for the reminder that hope can arrive unexpectedly. The night the puppy ran into his bus did more than save 2 young lives. It reminded Mark that compassion, bravery, and instinctive kindness could change the course of a moment, and sometimes even the course of a life. And every time he looked at the puppy curled peacefully in the passenger seat, he remembered how a tiny cry in the dark led him toward a terrifying discovery, a powerful rescue, and a renewed sense of purpose.